Deep Dive Film School makes no claim of ownership of the film footage used in this episode. The film footage is owned entirely by the copyright holders. Also, we're going to spoil the hell out of this movie, so this is your warning. Welcome to Deep Dive Film School!
Oh, this week we're getting into a punishment review of the Robert Zemeckis movie from 2018, Welcome to Marwen.
Let's dive in, huh? Alright everybody, I am Adam Sherlock.
And I'm Adam Pulcher.
And if you like what you see/hear, please like and subscribe. You can find us in all the spaces and places that people what?
Find good media.
That's right, that's right. Yeah.
Goddamn right.
Yeah.
Alright. Director of Forrest Gump and Back to the Future.
Yeah.
Finally, Robert Zemeckis. I actually love Robert Zemeckis. He's made lots of good stuff
He has
over
made
the
lots
years.
of good stuff.
Also, some questionable stuff. This would be those in the questionable area. This is an extension of our Complicated Failures Festival.
Yes, it is.
This was your choice of a film. Steve Carell, Leslie Mann. You know, everyone else I kind of had seen before, but it wasn't super familiar.
The one woman from the Game of Thrones is in it.
That's right.
Gwendolyn something. I don't know. Everybody knows what I'm talking about.
There's so few characters in Game of Thrones. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
So you said Robert Zemeckis, fan of movies that he's made. But let me ask you this.
They did. The poster says, from the maker of Forrest Gump.
So here's the thing. What's the last movie that he made that you can straight up say, yes, I love that movie? Because for me, it's Castaway.
Sure.
And that was a long time ago.
That was a long time ago.
And what he did, and this happens to these directors, is they spiral down into special effects land. Sure. And it's like they forget how to tell a story. Like, I feel like it happened with James Cameron.
I was going to say, did they have lunch with James Cameron?
Right, exactly. Right? Like it's just like you get so obsessed with how to do special effects.
He had that Flight movie with Denzel Washington.
But literally, isn't that the last...
I wouldn't say I was like, oh, that's a great movie. I know there's a lot of, and I'm sure we'll get into this with this movie, because a lot of people hate the animation style, but I do think Polar Express is actually a really good Christmas movie. I know a lot of people hate the animation, and I understand that to a degree. It is creepily like realistic and a little too much, but
so I actually believe that something. This is my dime store psychoanalysis theory. Something happened to Zemeckis
after Castaway.
When he got...
What's that, 2000, something like that?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, probably 2000, 99, 2000. So I think something happened when he jumped headfirst into this motion capture world. Because you had Polar Express, you had Beowulf, you had Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he sunk his teeth into this mocap thing to the degree that I'm like, he didn't understand all of the critiques people were giving him of... Dude, the uncanny valley is real. These people no longer have real human emotions, and that's why people don't like these movies, right? Is because when you just animate over a person, you lose the viability of what makes them human. And he was going, I disagree. I'm going to make another one next year, right? And to me, I'm like, that's like a form of like facial blindness. It's like you lost the ability to telegraph human emotions in a way that is like believable. And I saw Flight and I was like, hey, it's a return to form, not bad. Then I saw the fucking trailer for Welcome to Marwen and I was like, Zemeckis. Like, he went right back to it, right? And it's like some weird thing where he all of that ability that he had with something like Castaway, the Back to the Future films, which again, all these other movies do have special effects in them, tons of it.
Sure.
But put human beings in it. Put human beings in as the central role.
And I think I can understand the use of the animation if it was the whole thing, like a Polar Express or a Christmas Carol. You know, this is like, okay, this is an animated full thing, using your mocap stuff that you love to use and all that stuff. It's the full thing. We're here, you know, I want to tread lightly with this movie, even though it's not great. Because I want it to really be more about Zemeckis and the execution rather than the victim, you know, trying to poke fun at someone's maybe weird coping mechanisms, which he, for some reason, keeps focusing on through the whole movie rather than Mark actually getting better or trying to go through this stuff. And, you know, it seems like the animation or his escape, if you want to call it, takes over the movie. And then it almost seems like a gag that he just keeps going back to because he can't think of anything else to talk about.
And that's the thing that I want to talk about here. So just as, you know, to give a big, quick synopsis here.
Yeah, based on a true story.
Based on a true story. Mark Hogancamp was a pretty regular Joe Schmo who was married, had a drinking problem.
Like all of us.
Like all of us.
Cheers.
Was a artist, and also was I don't want to go so far as to say a full blown cross dresser, but had an obsession with women's shoes. No. And he at some point mentions
the essence of women.
Yeah, it's the essence of women. And at some point mentions this to a group of guys in a bar in his hometown, and they mercilessly beat him within an inch of his life. He has a severe traumatic brain injury.
It's a hate crime.
I mean, and he is in a coma for 9 days. He gets out of the coma and
doesn't remember virtually anything from his past
pretty
life.
Much his entire past life is gone, right? And so as a way to try and deal with this and in his own form of therapy, which again in the movie is considered to be this very like, and Mark struck out on his own, when it's like, no, his fucking Medicaid wouldn't pay for it. And they kicked him out of the hospital. So like he couldn't have real therapy anymore. He couldn't have any real rehabilitation anymore. Yeah, like that's all they would pay for are these drugs. So he started buying model stuff, and he wanted to do smaller models, but his hands shook too bad, and so he went with like the Barbie size dolls, and he basically created an alter ego, created a town, all these different things, and started telling these stories as a way to kind of like gain back some semblance of his life. It's actually an amazing story, and the first thing I'll say right out of the gates, if you don't watch the rest of this review, take away this one thing. Go watch Marwen Cole, the documentary. It's fantastic. That's actually about Mark Hogancamp. If you just watched that and you had seen Welcome to Marwen, you would understand why I'm so pissed off. Because
this is why it's a punishment.
The liberties that are taken here, and as to your point, the things that were focused on, like, to me, I'm like, God, Filelander missed the point, right? Like, you couldn't have missed the mark more by being like, and then all the dolls come to life and tell these stories. Like, first of all, yes, we are talking about a man who has a traumatic brain injury who's trying to find his best way to deal with all of this. But he's not delusional. He just cares more about the dolls than he does humans in his life because the dolls can't hurt him.
Yeah.
So he does get very focused and he tells the stories, but he knows they're not real.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, if you watch the documentary, you're like, he'll tell the stories in the same way that Steve Carell does in the movie, where he's like, oh, so-and-so, you know, went to the bar and then like all the Nazis showed up and da-da-da-da. And so, you know, how do these guys get back in and infiltrate?
A lot of loose metaphors that he's trying to hit on inside of the story, but it also just becomes... It just focuses on the wrong things, you know, like
completely. Like
I felt like, you know, I went into this not knowing who Mark was or his history, and honestly, the first time I watched this, I was just like, I don't totally get what they're trying to say here, because, you know, from someone who doesn't understand what he's going through or trying to cope with, you know, and you see the shoes and the dolls and that kind of stuff. They don't even fucking mention that he was an artist or a famous artist.
And he wasn't actually a famous artist.
Until he got assaulted?
No, he in the fictional movie version, he's like, oh, I drew these military comic books. He never did. He just had sketches at home. I don't know why. That's the thing. All of the fictionalized stuff that Zemeckis doesn't need to be there, okay?
Yeah.
It's not a single woman that keeps clumsily asking him out to dinner that runs the model shop. It's an older husband and wife who support Mark for decades. They wrote them out of it to put in... Oh, God. Okay, we'll get into it when it comes to the romantic subplots here, which piss me off to no end because none of them are real. Okay. None of them happened. Okay?
Well, then that makes even less sense then.
This is what I'm saying. Like, you hit the nail on the head with Zemeckis didn't know how to get in to the story because he didn't understand the story, right?
Yeah.
In fact, putting together all the motion capture stuff with all of these actors and actresses playing these dolls is missing the point 101, right? I mean, it in no way adds to anything else that's happening. And unfortunately, what it does, and I hope he doesn't do anything else like this, is it makes Steve Carell, when he's playing Mark Hogancamp, do this weird smiling through the tears Patch Adams bullshit that Robin Williams got mired in the late 90s, right? Where it's just like, you don't have to do that. Like, you can do cool, dramatic stuff that maybe has some wacky elements to it.
Yeah.
But doing this, like, weird, it just is the wrong fit.
Man. I actually, especially compared to the rest of the films in our festival, I actually thought, like, the acting is not the problem here. Like, everyone here is fine. They're doing what they're being told. They're, like, Steve Carell isn't distracting by any means. It's really the choices of the director that make what their characters are doing more distracting, right? And the things that he decides to concentrate on. I mean, it's probably not half the movie, but I'd say 35-40% of the movie is inside of this story world in his head where, from the back, when you pull up in the first scene, looks like a graveyard of dollhouses, but then once you see, it's actually a little town and he's got a whole thing. And the weird thing to me, and this maybe is starting to get into the romantic relationships of what you're talking about here, is that they all of these women are part of this story, right? And it's nothing but busty milkmaids that are saving his ass while he's fighting the Nazis, right? And it's just this like ultra male fantasy when it comes to that, when I don't think that's really what Mark was trying to do through a lot of this. And it was just confusing to try and understand, like, so are you trying to speak in metaphors in these scenes about how he's really thinking? When he's talking to Deja, and we find out later that that's really a vehicle for like his addiction, right?
Right.
And what that is, he's sitting there. Is he talking to himself? Is this him having conversations with himself? Like, what are these peripheral stories? And there's so much going on that, like, it wasn't really hard to focus on who to care about, but it was also like the execution just was confusing.
So the movie wants to have it both ways.
Yes.
The movie wants to say, yes, this is weird, but if you look close enough, you'll see Mark's heart and realize that it's all puppies and rainbows. And the fact is like, what he's doing is fucking weird. Sure. Yes, he has a traumatic brain injury.
But
this is how he's coping. He
concentrates on the weird stuff too much.
Well, but he concentrates on the weird stuff and then is prodding us to find it inspirational and not weird. There's only one moment where I'm like, oh, I can see a glimpse of the better movie that was in here. And it's when Leslie Mann's character, who plays the next door neighbor, who, again, in real life didn't exist. The woman who was the next door neighbor was married, and both her and her husband helped Mark out and, like, would drive him to town and, like were supportive. It was not a love interest.
It's so funny because this movie was going to be called The Women of Marwen.
Right. And he was
telling me there was no actual women on the
there were, and he was obsessed with these women, but what had to happen is that constantly these women had to be like, hey, Mark, just so you know, like, I'm flattered that you made a doll that looks like me, but like you're being a little creepy. Because that's real life, right? Like real life is that you tell a person, hey, we need to have boundaries.
Yeah.
Because, and I know, and I can say that to you because you have had a traumatic brain injury. So I'm here to tell you, like, you are my friend and I love you, but we're going to have these boundaries, right?
Totally.
And so
that is a confusing part of the movie to me.
It wants to have it both ways. And the moment that you see the glimpse of that better movie is when Leslie Mann is flipping through his old notebook of all of his drawings of women, and he's rattling off his favorite actresses, and he starts talking about his favorite porn actress, and like all the hot backdoor Betty 79,000 whatever movies that she's been in, and right as he's saying that, she flips to a page, and it looks like they're well done drawings, but it's like a 14-year-old made them because the girls have breasts larger than their heads. And she goes, ugh, and she gets kind of a little creeped out, right? And I was like, finally, a real human reaction, right? Because
I mean, the same thing happens when he asked her to marry him at the end. Like, he's obsessed.
Yeah.
Right? He's too infatuated with this lady. And the fact that none of these ladies may be real to a degree, but that specific one who he's obsessed with never even existed. It's so weird to me. And the fact that the stories that he has and that he's telling through his photography and these dolls, all of these women know that they're in the story, and they all know what the story is, and hey, what's going to happen next. And to me, that was so weird.
It's not the way people would react.
No one would accept that and be like, "Oh, you made a doll of me, and now you're telling this really sexualized story of you being a man in heels, fighting the Nazis."
And let's talk about that moment where that moment where the Mark in the movie proposes to Leslie Mann's character. Mm-hmm. It is so heart-rattlingly awkward and pathetic, and we see it coming from a mile away. And having watched the documentary before I watched this, I listened to the This American Life story.
I'm really interested in the documentary.
Documentary's fantastic.
I need to watch that.
But the woman that's the next door neighbor talks about, like, yeah, Mark was telling me, like, and the doll of me and him got married, and she's like, and I just said to him, I was like, Mark, you got to know that's weird, because, like, I'm married and you're friends with my husband, and
you're complimenting me on my torpedoes.
Yeah, like, it's weird, right? And he was like, yeah, I know, and he kind of like kicked at the dirt, because he's like, yes, you can tell that he's a person who's been through a severely traumatic experience in his life, but he also understands, because, like, he even said, there's a moment early in the documentary where he's like, yeah, like, sometimes my buddies come over and they're looking out in the yard and they're like, well, you got a bunch of Barbies out there. And he's like, well, yeah, what are the guys supposed to do if there aren't some Barbies around for them to, like, have some fun with? Like, you want it just to be a bunch of guys out there, and then he kind of laughs about it. But he's like, yeah, I play with dolls, whatever, and it's like he's way more grounded, even though he does enjoy these fictional parts of his life. To me, the fact that Zemeckis fictionalized moments like this proposal to put a fictionalized version of a real life man that he met who has a traumatic fucking brain injury to be embarrassed like that in a movie is so messed up to me. And I couldn't find anything online about how Mark feels about the movie.
That's what I was just going to ask.
He very well may not have ever watched it. I could believe that if it was like, I have no interest in seeing it.
I hope he didn't.
I hope he didn't, for moments like that where I'm like, that is so unnecessary to put that character through that, because he even says in the documentary, oh, I'm never going to get married. He's like, I've been hurt enough in my life. The last thing I want to do, like, that's why I made Marwen Call.
Yeah.
Is because I don't want to get hurt.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to say about every character being a woman. He doesn't have any male friends, obviously, because, he's traumatized by the guys who beat him up.
That's also outside fake, of his, by the way.
What? He
has male friends that are also other members of that he made dolls of. One of his best friends is in the documentary, and he's a dude.
Yeah.
And he's like, the greatest honor you could ever get is becoming a doll in Marwen Call.
Yeah.
And he's like, and so, like, there are many men in Mark's life.
In this movie, other than the lawyer, maybe, there's none. And it's all about the ladies. And, it's, him getting in touch with his feminine side to some degree, or whatever he feels he needs to go through. It's really, at a point I was really, like, wondering, like, so first off, like, is this the drugs that he's taking that is making him really get into this? Because he doesn't necessarily act super strange, other than the creation of the story as he's coming up with it. It seems like he's this kind of, like, stream of consciousness, like, yeah, maybe she does this and does that, and we shoot the guy in the bell tower, which I have to say, I don't know if you noticed, but there was a Wilhelm scream in here.
I did notice
the first time I, like, thought, and I was like, ah!
It's a Wilhelm scream!
Yeah, it doesn't happen often. Actually, it does happen often. We just don't, like, register it.
Yeah.
So, but I actually pointed that out here. But, like, this movie could have gone more in, I want to say, like a Fisher King route, you know?
Yes.
Fisher King is probably the closest comparison I can have to something like this that is successful, right? You have a guy who's been through a traumatic event, who's trying to cope and understand his life throughout this, and he has these wild stories and ideas around reality, around his persona, all of that stuff. And it could have been as good as Fisher King, and it just wasn't.
Well, and when you talk about that, and that's what I think is really interesting, is that, like, again, I don't know why there's
like, would you say this is a fantasy film?
That's the problem, is that when it goes into these flights of fancy, there's one in particular that, to me, and you're right about the Fisher King analogy, and I thought about the Fisher King as a comparison, and I rarely say this, but the moment in this movie where he goes into his fantasy land in the courtroom is just fucking inappropriate.
Yeah.
It is just, like, the Nazi pops up from underneath the table, he's life-size, and he shoots the jurors and the judge. He kills all of them. And of course we know it's not real because it's a big, fleshy, rubbery,
version.
Nazi.
Fritz.
Yeah. But I was like, I literally in the moment was like, well, this is just inappropriate. Why did you kill all these characters like that? But do you know what I mean? I was like, what's this?
You guys do you have insurance?
Like, let him see that he thinks the Nazi's there and then he runs away or whatever. But like this level of the flights of fancy are just ridiculous to the point that I'm like, I don't know how I'm supposed to feel in this moment. Now, you mentioned Fisher King. Here is one of my tangents. Let's talk about the movie Lars and the Real Girl.
Okay, that's a good one too.
So our main character is going through something in Lars and the Real Girl, right? But the movie focuses on the people around Ryan Gosling and how they're reacting to how weird and inappropriate and problematic Ryan Gosling's behavior is. And we get these side conversations where they're concerned about their friend or their brother or whomever, right? But all we see is what they see. All we see is Ryan Gosling and a sex doll, right?
We don't go inside with Ryan Gosling very often. It's the outside perspective.
Exactly. And yet somehow the weird of that discomfort makes us more empathetic to Ryan Gosling's character because we understand how heartbreaking that is, right? In Welcome to Marwen, we miss a giant character that is a huge part of Mark's life, which is his mom, who it still takes care of him. And she's like, my son is in his 40s and he plays with dolls in a town that he built outside of the trailer that he lives in on disability. I am glad that he has something he cares about, but it's fucking heartbreaking every time I go over there. And I can't help it. I'm his mom. I've known him his whole life, right? That would have been a really important character to have in this movie, but we don't have that, right?
Way more than the fake neighbor who isn't actually a busty Leslie Mann.
So, Lars and the Real Girl never tries to normalize Ryan Gosling's behavior. It's always awkward and weird, right? And we watch him go through the process until he's able to pull himself out of it. And obviously that's not what happens in real life with Mark Hogancamp. But I posit you this. If Lars and the Real Girl had a moment where Ryan Gosling goes into the room and shuts the door and looks at Bianca, and she hops up and starts singing and dancing and doing the cha-cha, it takes a movie that is otherwise about the human condition and turns it into fucking Mannequin.
Yeah.
It literally turns it into the movie Mannequin, because that's what Mannequin's about. Only he can see that they're real. And that's what fucking Zemeckis did with this otherwise, like, amazing and interesting and troubling, but also somehow uplifting story of Mark Hogancamp. He turned it into Mannequin.
It's trying to figure out what is the most challenging part of his life, but ignoring that, right? Yeah. They're ignoring the hard parts and just leaning into the weird parts of how he copes or what he's dealing with or whatever, how he wants to connect with his femininity or whatever it is.
And then trying to get us to feel like it's not weird.
Yeah.
And the
But like he has, he has dolls in glass cases and 287 pairs of women's shoes.
And he loves watching pornos. And like, I'm glad they at least included a tiny bit of that.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's okay. We're adults. We can watch a movie with a character who has nuance.
Sure.
They don't all have to be like, oh, but he's got a heart of gold. And it's like, well, technically, he was a horrible alcoholic who had already destroyed his marriage long before he got in that bar fight. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, he really was. Like, he stayed living in the same town. So the idea that everyone in that small town is like, he's the lovable misfit with his little dolls. And
everyone felt so bad for him on that day.
But really? Or do people have complex feelings because that's real life?
And this in particular kind of pissed me off, is when someone asks for a time machine and they get a fucking DeLorean. And I'm like, Zemeckis, now you're making it about you. I know you want to fucking throw Back to the Future, and it's one of my all-time favorite movies, so I appreciate it this much. And it actually more pisses me off that you're making it about you, and you have the music and the tire streets and everything.
This isn't Ready Player One.
Yeah.
Well, and the time machine does make an appearance in the documentary, and it's made out of an old VHS player. It's it's a rectangle.
I love it. See, that would have been more fun.
Yeah.
Why do you got to make it about your filmography?
Yeah. Well, I completely agree, and it pissed me off too. And there's lots of other inconsistencies, and I think like if you're, I a million years ago, a very infamous moment on our podcast where I dragged the shit out of Braveheart because of the historical inaccuracies in that. And to be completely fair, I was just being a dick.
Yeah.
Because what Braveheart is actually about is about like the enduring human spirit and fighting for what's right and all these big concept things. It wasn't actually about William Wallace. None of those specifics mattered, right? Because it was about the story. This is a movie that's supposed to be about Mark Hogancamp.
Yeah.
And there's so many interesting things that are left out. The photographer who first, quote unquote, discovered him, that just saw this guy that was like pulling around this little Jeep. Mm-hmm. And he was a photographer who worked for this art gallery and was like, how many miles you got on that thing? And they started talking and kind of chatting. And he's like, oh yeah. And he's like, I set this up in my house and I do, I take pictures and da-da-da. And he was like, huh. And he's like, well, send me a couple of pictures. In the documentary, you get that guy's perspective. And he's like, 2 days later, there was an envelope in my mailbox and I opened it and he's like, and I was shook by the photos I saw. I had never seen anything like it. He's like, he has an interesting story if his artwork sucked. But he has an interesting story, and then his photography is brilliant, right? And he doesn't know what his f-stop is, what his aperture is. He doesn't know any of that. He's just shooting it, right? Mm-hmm. He's just telling these stories. And he's like, that arc of the discovery and then him getting his actual gallery and all that is so inspiring and amazing. And it's what the documentary hinges on.
It's what it should be about.
It's what it should have been about. And then...
But instead, these two things pissed me off.
Yes.
And I know we've talked about how this movie has pissed us off. But I'm sorry, but anyone who went through what he went through isn't going to have a fucking book of all the newspaper clippings of this traumatic event and like, remember back when I got my ass kicked
and I was in a coma for 9 days.
Look, it's in the paper. First off,
Medicare wouldn't pay for it, and they kicked me out of the hospital.
Let's remember that.
Yeah, you're not going to have a scrapbook.
First off, come on.
Totally.
And then secondly, Leslie Mann tries to do something nice for him, and it's buy him a Nazi doll that like triggers him. I'm like, don't buy anyone a Nazi doll for a present ever.
Yep. Also,
even if they have a whole dollhouse town in the backyard that's based around World War II.
Worst
present ever.
Worst like housekeeping if you're doing a housewarming gift for somebody, don't buy him a Nazi doll.
Those are two obvious triggers that you should not do.
And
right?
This is the other weird thing is that yes, in real life Mark Hogancamp did turn his assailants into the Nazis that are the bad guys in Marwen Cole.
Yeah.
But the whole neo-Nazi subplot, none of it existed. None of it existed. In fact, one of the guys that beat him up, that assaulted him, claimed in an interview that they assaulted him because they thought he was a neo-Nazi. Because like he has German heritage, and they were telling like kind of off-color jokes at the bar, I think. Also, and I mean, sorry, this is real life, those guys didn't do any time. Like, they got charges pressed against them, and like 2 guys did like some county jail time. That was it. Nobody went to prison. None of that happened.
They were out before he was out of the coma.
Yeah, they weren't neo-Nazis, and I think they got a slap on the wrist. Right? So like all of that has been heightened to this level. But here's the thing, and this is one of the last things I want to say, is talking about missing the point. I want you to imagine if Charlie Kaufman directed this movie.
Oh, man.
Because the last 5 minutes of the documentary, all the beats of what happens in Marwen Cole do happen in the documentary. Like all of the sort of like, and then the women have to come in and they got to save Hoagie and like all that stuff. He really does create that world, right?
Sure,
like he does all those things.
I never doubted that.
Right. That's another part I had a problem with. But he said the Nazis had tortured Hoagie. And so afterwards, Hoagie was having lots of PTSD. And like he was having a hard time running the bar in Marwen. Like he was having a hard time doing all the regular things he did. So Hoagie decided that he was going to start buying dolls and recreating his own. So the doll of Hoagie, he makes a tiny Marwen Cole, and there's tiny dolls, and the doll is taking photographs of the even tinier dolls. Okay? So Hoagie is now Mark Hogancamp. So I mean, it's synecdoche, right?
Yeah, I was going to say Kaufman would have fun with that.
Dude, why didn't Zemeckis put it in the movie? It's the most interesting part.
Interesting.
I kept waiting for it, watching the movie. I was like, when is Hoagie going to start making his own tiny dolls? And he never did it. And I was like, no, dude, that's the healing arc of your character, is that your main character realizes even the badass alter ego version of you also can be traumatized and needs a coping mechanism. That's what the movie's about. That's what it's supposed to be about.
But he's wearing heels at his show at the end.
Jesus Christ. And he does in real life, but he also has to be prodded into doing it.
Sure.
The fact that he left out the tiny dolls inside the world of the dolls, I'm like...
I hadn't heard that part.
Fucking missed the boat, dude. Like, that's total Charlie Kaufman.
This would be a total different movie with Charlie Kaufman.
Wouldn't it be a great film?
I bet it would be.
Yeah.
I would be really interested to see where he would take it, because he's got a wild mind and is not afraid to go there, but like in a much more artistic way. He understands what's important. I don't think Zemeckis did.
No, he didn't. He missed the point. He just did. Like, I know I've said that like 30 times in this review, but I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah.
Like, it's such an inspiring and deeply complex story. And maybe that's one of the hard things, is that tell me another really complex story that Zemeckis has tackled. Because even the book of Forrest Gump, in the book of Forrest Gump, he is not an all-inspiring character. Like, there's some things he does in his life that he's a shithead, and the movie just pulled all that stuff out of the book.
Yeah.
Right? Because they were like, he was like, nah, that seems complicated. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can get John Lennon's mouth to look even more realistic. That's what I'm concerned with. So I think that complexity, he's just not...
It's true. It happens with directors that do lean into what you were saying at the beginning, like a James Cameron. You concentrate so much on that, you forget about, hey, I need to tell a real story that connects with people. Because it doesn't matter. Pick any movie that has a good story. It doesn't matter who made it, what level it's on, who's in it. If it's a good story, it's a good story. And if it's interesting and it will connect to the human emotion, then we'll watch it and enjoy it.
Yeah.
But if it's just something that is CGI jerk-off fest about some guy who was an artist and then got assaulted and then became obsessed, it's like you're getting too concentrated on the things that actually disconnect people from human emotion, not the things that are important that we could be relating to him with.
Exactly. You glossed over all the elements that you thought would make people uncomfortable. And it's like, that's okay. The shades of gray in life are what makes art worth making. right? Is if you can create something where you can leave somebody with a feeling at the end of it of like, yeah, I guess that was great, but it would have been nicer if he had had a normal life and not gotten the shit kicked out of him so that he has to play with dolls for the rest of his life. Right? Like, why is that a bad thought to have? But the movie is terrified that anyone might leave the theater thinking that. So they're like, it's girl power time, and we're going to have rocket launchers with like our boobs hanging out. And you're like, Jesus, stop for 5 minutes.
Yeah, it becomes this overly sexualized male fantasy when that's really like, yeah, he may have that part of him, but why are you concentrating on that part of him when there's so much deeper emotion and trauma that he's gone through?
Yeah, let it pop up, let it be awkward, let your characters redirect themselves and have an awkward, like, kind of uncomfortable laugh about it and move on with their life.
But by the end, you're just like, how am I supposed to feel?
Yeah. Am I supposed to be really excited that the dolls won? From the Nazi dolls, I guess.
Strange movie.
Watch the documentary.
Interesting punishment review. I definitely will watch the documentary. I'm very fascinated now. I went into this kind of blind, not knowing who Mark was. And so now I'm extremely fascinated to kind of see what the real story is after this mess of an interpretation.
Yeah. He's a very complex character, and it's a very complex story that you're supposed to be left having very mixed feelings about the way in which... Yeah, that's what makes art great, is that you leave it and you go, I don't know, maybe it's this,
challenges
maybe
you,
it's
right?
that, and that's what it should have been, instead of... Although, final thought, when they made the G.I. Joe movies, instead of having it be live action, it should have been this.
That's a good point.
How badass would that have been if it was like high drama action movie?
Zemeckis, you missed the boat.
Dude. And you still could have had Bruce Willis and all those other dumbasses in it, but if they all were motion capture and like, you know, their arm gets blown off and they go and pop it back on, like, that would be the best movie.
Totally.
I would totally watch that movie.
Same here. You got it, Zemeckis. Listen.
You listening?
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was a great end to the Complicated Failures Festival. Really fascinating, fun festival. Next up, we're going to do a stop motion animation festival.
Yep.
But first, we're going to get into That One Scene next week. We're going to do That One Scene from Swingers, the great 1999 indie film with
96, 99?
99.
99, damn, also.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
So, yeah, that's a good year for film.
Yeah.
Maybe I wrote that down wrong, though. I'll double check that. But, so we're getting into that. But just make sure you like and subscribe. We got all sorts of things to follow and a ton of fun stuff on our channel.
Yep.
And hit the notification bell, do all the things, and we will see you for That One Scene next week.
Bye, you guys.